Chapter 42. Matt Pine. Matt walked into the diner, the familiar ring of the bell on the door bringing him back to when he was a kid, and they'd go to Ann's for breakfast on Sunday mornings. He had a vision of Danny sitting in front of a giant stack of pancakes, his mother stealing a bite with her fork. It was strange, the things you remembered. Like the bar last night, the place seemed to go quiet at his presence. A beat of silence followed by murmurs. Today, the looks weren't so subtle, heads following him as he passed, necks craning. He threaded through the tables to a booth in the back. Special Agent Keller sat with a cup of coffee in front of her, steam wafting from the mug. Matt slid into the booth across from her. The diner's patrons were still giving him looks. "Good morning," Keller said. "Morning." She regarded him. "You look tired," she said. She was right about that. After meeting Jessica, he'd gotten 2 hours of sleep at most. He suppressed a yawn. The waitress came over, topped off Keller's coffee, asked if she needed anything. Matt could swear it was the same woman from when he was a kid, the same beehive hairstyle. She treated Matt like he was invisible. Keller flicked Matt a glance, frowned. He wasn't imagining it. The waitress was purposefully ignoring him. "I'll have a cup of coffee, please," Matt said. He wasn't a huge fan of coffee, but he wasn't sure he'd get through the day without it. The waitress made a noise in her throat. She hesitated as if she were going to refuse, but filled the mug without saying a word. "Sure you want to be seen with me?" Matt said to Keller after the waitress had left. "They are making your food, you know." Keller gave a close-lipped smile. "I suppose they think no Pine should ever set foot in here, the diner where Charlotte worked," Matt said. "I'm not sure that's it," Keller said. Matt gave her a look. Keller laid a newspaper on the table. On the front page of the Lincoln Journal-Star was a photo of Matt next to one of Danny. Matt looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, hair tousled. Maybe even worse than he looked today. It was the photo from his college ID. He remembered taking it after a night of partying, that first week of school, freshman year, when everyone went crazy from the lack of parental supervision. How did the newspaper get it? Next to Matt was Danny's mugshot. Together, the photos made them look like criminals. Half true, but still. Worse, the headline. "A violent nature brothers suspects in murder of family." What the? Matt looked around the room, appreciating the hostility now. They think I had something to do with... Matt felt his throat constrict. His mouth was bone dry. "I was in New York. Danny's in prison, for fuck's sake. How could they say... I'm going to fucking sue them." Keller waited patiently, letting him get it all out. Finally, Matt just sat staring at his coffee mug, trying to process it all. "I'm really sorry," Keller said. Matt's emotions were raging. He tried to read the story, but he couldn't focus on the words. The world was tilting. "I'm sorry," the agent said again. Why would they say this? "I don't know. Someone leaked that the crime scene may have been staged, the work of a professional, and that your father had an unusually large insurance policy. That's probably all it took." Matt swallowed again, his mouth a desert. "It's not right," Matt said, his voice laced with emotion. "I know, Matthew," Keller said. "Is it true that the scene was staged?" Keller hesitated. "We're still investigating," she said. "But maybe." "The funeral is tomorrow, and everybody's going to think—" Matt repressed a sob. He needed to get it together. "Here, have some water." Keller slid Matt her glass and he downed it. There's more, Matt. When the Mexican authorities returned your family, they included their effects. All of the phones and laptops had been wiped clean, and it wasn't some mistake by the local cops taking the devices into inventory. They'd been scrubbed in a way that there was zero chance of retrieving any data. Not even the most skilled computer forensics agents at the Bureau could recover anything. Whoever wiped them down knew what they were doing. But who? Why? Matt's voice was still quavering. I don't know. Do you think it's related to Danny's case? I honestly don't know. Matt wanted to scream. Then what the fuck do you know? But it wasn't the agent's fault. As if reading his thoughts, Keller said, Here's what I do know. After your sister posted the video of the party on social media, she and your dad planned the Mexico trip to chase a lead. What are you talking about? A friend of Maggie's from school is a computer whiz. Right before your family left for Mexico, she asked him to track down the location of a phone that called your dad's phone. The kid traced it to Tulum, Mexico, and your father also made several Google searches about Tulum. That's why they went to Mexico? Tracking down some clue about my brother's case? It explained the spur-of-the-moment trip, and it smacked of Dad and Maggie. Also, Maggie asked her friend if it was possible to make a video call, but digitally make it look like someone else was calling. The kid made her a video, putting someone else's face on your sister's. I watched it, and it looked real. And let me guess, Matt said. It was Charlotte's face. How'd you know? Keller asked. Apparently there are rumors that she's still alive, that it wasn't Charlotte's body at the creek. Keller frowned. Matt continued. So, if someone wanted to lure my sister, or more likely my father, somewhere, they might do it by pretending Charlotte was still alive. It's possible, Keller said. But why get them to go all the way to Mexico? And who? Why? I don't know. I'm waiting on test results for some evidence found at the scene. What evidence? What? I'll tell you more when I get the results. It could be nothing. But I've also got Carlita Escobar, the consular officer you met in Tulum, checking some things out. Matt would never forget Escobar, the tough woman who'd caused the Mexican cop to nearly piss himself. He felt an ache in his chest. It was so Maggie to be on the hunt for evidence. Keller slid a computer tablet across the table. Matt looked at the screen. It was the photo Maggie had sent him from Mexico. We enhanced the photo, Keller said. Matt stared at his father, standing on a road in Tulum. The shadow of a bicycle, a sweat ring at his neck, like he'd been out for a ride. Keller put her index finger and thumb together on the screen and opened them, zooming in on the photo. Behind his father, a couple was standing in front of a building, and for the first time, Matt saw it. Oh my God, Matt said, his pulse quickening. A shot of adrenaline galloped through him. Maggie hadn't really been taking a photo of her father, but using him as the pretext to shoot the couple. The woman was pretty, wore a bikini and shorts, and Matt suspected she had an Oklahoma accent. Right before she died, Maggie had sent Matt a photo of Hank. But that wasn't the thing that caused Matt's heart to pound. No, it was the tall man next to Hank. He had a hand on his face, like he was going to wipe his brow. Or perhaps he was trying to hide his face, only part of which was visible. Enough to show a scar from a cleft lip.
Chapter 43. Sarah Keller. After breakfast, Keller stood outside the diner with Matt. Her mind was racing. The woman in the photo Maggie Pine had sent to Matt was the same woman who'd lured him to the woods, taken his phone. And the man with the cleft lip fit the description of the guy who'd shoved Matt into the street, tried to steal his belongings. Who were they? What did they want? And why had Maggie Pine sent her brother the photograph on her last day alive? Keller turned to Matt. "You need a ride to the nursing home?" She gestured her chin at her maroon Nissan rental, parked at the curb near the diner. "Nah, my aunt is picking me up." Matt glanced down the street. "Shit," he said. Keller was going to ask what was wrong when she saw Judy and Ira Adler, the directors of A Violent Nature, walking toward them. Judy Adler nodded hello to Keller, then turned to Matt. Her husband hung back, as if conflicted. "Matthew," Judy said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Matt offered a dismissive nod. "I know this is a terrible time, and I know you wanted nothing to do with us on the last film, but we're doing a follow-up to the documentary, and we'd love to talk to you. We think it could really help your brother, and—" "Not interested," Matt said. He gazed down the road as if looking for his aunt's car. "Matthew, you're a filmmaker. You have to understand we're just doing our jobs. And you may not have cared for it, but A Violent Nature got your brother's case on the map. No one cared until we—" "Until you what?" Matt said. "Until you got everyone's hopes up, made my father look crazy, pulled my little sister into this mess, made my family the most hated people in this town? And for what? Matthew, I said, not interested." Keller was surprised at the emotion, the hurt, in Matt's voice. "My brother's still in jail," Matt continued, "and my family went to Mexico on some hunt for clues. If it weren't for this fucking quest, your film, they'd at least be alive. My sister would be leaving for college. My little brother would be finishing first grade." Keller saw the glint in Judy Adler's eyes. Matt had unintentionally given them some new information. The reason his family had gone to Mexico. Matt seemed to realize it too. He turned to Keller, his eyes apologizing. Keller gave a look back that said, "It's okay." "I'm just asking you to hear us out," Judy said. "We've uncovered new evidence. It could really help. I think your dad would want you to just hear what we have to say." Keller was about to intercede when Matt's aunt pulled up. She idled the car in front of the diner. Matt turned to Keller. "Thanks for the coffee. Keep me posted on things," he said. His Aunt Cindy gave the Adlers the stink eye out the car window. When they looked over at her, she held out her middle finger. Keller and the Adlers watched the car disappear, along with the filmmaker's hopes of interviewing Matt Pine for their sequel to A Violent Nature. "New evidence, eh?" Keller said pointedly to the couple. Judy said, "Newer than that CODIS and DNA analysis you promised us." "I'm calling in every favor I have to get us moved to the front of the line," Keller said. Judy frowned. "I'm supposed to hear tonight. The moment I get the results, I promise I'll call. Until then, what's this new evidence?" Judy looked at her husband, who gave a tiny shrug as if to say, "Why not?" Keller gestured for the diner's door, somewhere they could sit and talk. "No, not in there," Judy said. "You think they don't like the Pines? Well, they really don't like us. We've set up base at a farmhouse about 10 minutes from here. I'll follow you there." The farmhouse had seen better days, the paint peeling, porch sagging. Several dogs scattered as the Adlers parked the van on a patch of dirt that passed for a driveway. Keller pulled the Nissan beside them. Judy got out of the van, a dented Ford. Ira trailed behind his wife. something Keller suspected he'd been doing for as long as the Adlers had been married. Judy waved to Keller to follow them inside. Keller climbed out of her car and looked around. A barn was about 30 yards away, the door falling off its hinges. Beyond that, just fields, not another soul for miles. She stepped around the mud and muck and mounted the porch steps. The wood was soft from rot. She stopped at the door and looked inside the place. 2 men in their 20s sat in front of laptops at a long kitchen table. Stacks of papers and empty soda cans cluttered the workspace. Dishes were piled in the sink. A woman, heavy-set and wearing sneakers and sweats, was also at the far end of the kitchen table, talking on her cell phone. Judy called to Keller from inside. "Come on in. We don't bite." The interior was just as run down. Cracked linoleum floors, faded wallpaper with bare patches, as if someone had started trying to remove it and given up. An avocado green refrigerator matched the green laminate countertops. Ira cleared away some of the trash and clutter from the table, making a space for their guest. "Please, have a seat." Judy introduced Keller to the others, the production team, who all seemed more attentive when they learned that Keller was with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Sorry about the mess," Ira said, sitting next to his wife, across from Keller. "We've had a lot of late nights around here. Get you some coffee or something to drink?" "I'm fine. Already hit my caffeine quota, but thank you." Keller looked at the monitors and equipment. "How's the sequel coming?" "Slow." "How's your investigation into the death of the Pines going?" "Same," Keller said. Judy Adler gave a slight chuckle, as if amused at Keller's evasive response. She said, "We've been looking into Charlotte, and what we've found is, surprising." Judy looked at a member of the production team. He had a man bun and wore flip-flops with jeans. "Show her." Keller caught the faint whiff of weed as the guy set a laptop in front of her. He tapped on a few keys, then went back to his seat. The screen showed a woman, mid-20s, her hair a dull shade of purple. "Charlotte wasn't just my cousin. She was my best friend," the woman said. "You were a close family?" Judy Adler asked from off-camera. The woman made a noise that said, "Fat chance." "My mom and Charlotte's dad had major issues. They haven't talked in years." "Why's that?" "Uncle John abused my mom when they was kids. Sexually, I mean." A chill crawled up Keller's back. The woman said it so matter-of-fact, and from what Keller knew about sexual abusers, they didn't tend to stop as they got older. The victims just changed. She continued to watch the video. "But you and Charlotte were close?" "Oh, yeah. My mom was worried, you know. She told Charlotte she could come to Kansas, stay with us, anytime." "Do you think Charlotte was being abused by your uncle?" The woman nodded. "Did she tell you that?" "Not in so many words." "But you thought so?" She nodded again. "Long as I can remember, she was always talking about getting out of Adair, moving to a big city, changing her name, starting over." "Did you ever talk to her about it? What was happening at home, I mean?" "We didn't need to. It was just understood." "Did you know her boyfriend?" "Who, Danny?" "I talked to him a few times when me and Charlotte were Skyping." "Were you surprised when you heard he'd been arrested?" "Oh, yeah. I mean, we was in shock. It was funny, 'cause that show made a big thing about Danny and Charlotte, like they were high school sweethearts on their way to the altar or something. But he saw other people, and so did she." "You're saying they weren't serious?" "Not from what Charlotte told me. She always said Danny Pine was a sweet, dumb jock. They had a good time, but it wasn't like they was getting married." She saw other boys? I think. Though she thought all the kids at school were immature. Did she mention anyone in particular? She said there was someone, an older boy, but wouldn't tell me who. Why not? The woman shrugged. Did you know she was pregnant? I don't think she was. But they ran tests, and if that was her... She said this with a roll of her neck, almost like a challenge. I don't understand. About a week before it happened, she said she couldn't take it anymore. She was going to take off. Couldn't take what anymore? The woman looked off camera like it was a stupid question. She didn't say, but it was obvious. Her dad. So you're saying... Then who was at the creek? And why didn't the police... I don't know. But Charlotte said she had friends. Important people who could help her get away. Who were these friends? Judy Adler reached over and stopped the video. We talked to some of Charlotte's friends. Charlotte had a bit of a secret life. Older boys, drugs. She'd told one friend she'd been assaulted, and she was afraid. Keller gave Judy a skeptical glance. There was a trial, blood work. Her body was positively identified. Ira Adler snapped his fingers and pointed at Keller. Exactly. And guess who contacted us, saying he had something that would blow up what everybody thought about the case, involving the blood work. Keller shook her head. Ron Sampson. The cop who interrogated Danny Pine? We were scheduled to meet, and then... He killed himself, Keller said. Ira tilted his head to the side, held Keller's stare like maybe Sampson hadn't killed himself. It was all too much. Too many conspiracies, too many leaps, and Keller was starting to think the Adlers had been drinking the Kool-Aid. Charlotte's father moved to North Dakota, Ira added. We've asked him for access to her things, to let us exhume the body for a DNA test, but he's refused to speak with us. What a surprise. The guy they were accusing of being a child molester didn't want to cooperate. Keller glanced at the computer screen again. In one of the windows, she saw a familiar face. Noah Braun. Judy Adler followed Keller's gaze and said, We interviewed him again. We're hoping that the climax of our film will be a pardon, but we'll see. Keller gestured to the computer. May I? She asked. Judy nodded, and Keller clicked on the window with Braun's handsome face. The interview started with Judy's voice off-screen. Do you think, with all the attention on Danny Pine, Charlotte got forgotten? Absolutely not. I certainly never forgot her. But we won't get justice for her if the wrong man is in prison. We won't get justice until the truth comes out. Judy stopped the video. You get the idea. More of the same from the last time. The smasher, the UP, blah, blah, blah. We'll see if he puts his money where his mouth is on the pardon. You don't think he'll pardon Danny now that he's governor? Acting governor, Judy said. He only got the job because the former governor was a crook and had a taste for young girls. I suspect Braun will tread lightly until he's actually voted into the office. Have you been following the scandal? Loosely. The former governor is a real sleaze, and his henchman, what's his name, Ira? Flanagan. Neil Flanagan, her husband replied. That's right. This Flanagan is straight out of a movie. Who knows? It may be our next documentary. Right, Ira? Her husband shrugged. Anyway, Nebraska is unusual since the governor doesn't hold the power to pardon on his own. Braun's part of a pardon board, and he may be waiting to see who else the governor's henchman snitches on before he starts associating himself with the former governor's people on the board. That administration was dirty. Politics. It didn't matter how big or small. It usually was dirty. "Okay, we've shown you ours," Judy said. "How about you show us yours?" "I told you. I'll call as soon as I get the CODIS and DNA analysis." "You've got to have more than that," Judy said. "Just talk to us. Deep background. No one will ever know. The family, they were murdered, right? And what Matthew said, were they really in Mexico chasing a lead? That sounds like Evan. He just couldn't let go." "I'm sorry," Keller said. "I can't comment." Judy Adler's mouth was a tight seam. "But I'll tell you what," Keller added. "I'll talk to Matt. Encourage him to speak with you. It was a lie, but no reason to piss off the Adlers. Keep your enemies closer and all that. If they found a lead, she wouldn't want them holding a grudge." "That would be terrific," Ira Adler said. He'd probably spent their entire marriage playing good cop. Judy added, "We really do want to help his brother." "Keep telling yourself that," Keller thought. Chapter 44. Maggie Pine. Before. Maggie looked across the aisle of the cramped flight. Mom and Dad were talking about something, smiling. It had been a while since she'd seen that, and it took a little of the sting out of the past few days. She glanced at Tommy, next to her, with all the essentials spread out on the tray table. Coloring books, goldfish crackers, juice box, and his favorite stuffed animal, Sweet Bear. He was watching a movie, one with those creepy blue creatures, the Smurfs, on the tiny screen of Mom's phone. Maggie wanted to get her mother alone. They hadn't had a moment since they'd whisked Mom away from one airport gate to another. Mom and Tommy stepped off the plane from Omaha, and 3 hours later were boarding the flight to Mexico. Maggie had expected her mother to be annoyed that it was all so unplanned. She hadn't even gotten to pack her own bag for the beach. But Mom was either putting on a face, or she was excited to go, energized by the spontaneity. Or maybe it was seeing Dad so upbeat. Ever since Maggie had found him on the floor when he'd passed out, drunk or food poisoned, she still couldn't decide. He'd been different. Make no mistake, Danny's case was still the giant hippo in the room. Or was it elephant? She could never remember. Whatever. But her father seemed more available, more present. Maggie wondered if her mother would be so carefree about the trip if she knew why they were going. She certainly wouldn't be smiling and ordering another wine right now. Watching her mother drain the plastic cup, laugh at something her father said, Maggie didn't care why they were going. Maybe she'd hold off telling Mom about what had happened with Eric. Why ruin the trip, right? Maggie could handle it. Just don't think about it. But it wasn't so easy. She felt a prickling down her spine, remembering how he'd pinned her arms against the wall. She still had fingerprint bruises on her wrists. She was being melodramatic. It wasn't like he'd raped her. But she'd felt so powerless, so scared, so ashamed. But if she told Mom, then Mom would tell Dad, and then well, the trip would be wrecked. Maggie also didn't think her father could take another instance where he hadn't been there to protect one of his kids. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and Maggie clutched the armrest. Tommy gazed up at her, smiling, the headphones giant on his head. When was the last time she'd felt that safe and secure, that invincible? Had she ever? She thought so, before a young girl was found murdered at Stone Creek. The boogeyman could still be out there, her dad reminded her and anyone who'd listen. Maggie had been on the hunt for him ever since. Sure, she'd had doubts over the years. She didn't really know Danny. She'd been only 10 when he went away. He'd been larger than life. The boy who playfully called her dork mussed her hair whenever he walked by, gave her piggyback rides. She remembered him playing tea party with her and her dolls, remembered going to the football games, feeling special that she was Danny Pine's sister. She didn't remember Danny being home much. Back then, their parents didn't believe in monsters and let the kids come and go. Maggie knew Danny was no saint. He drank too much, wasn't particularly kind to the unpopular kids, and wasn't a great boyfriend, at least from what Maggie had learned working his case over the years. But he also wasn't a murderer. She believed that. Needed to believe that. Maggie chewed the inside of her cheek, examining the purple spots on her wrists again, wondering if Mom would notice them. She then caught her father gazing at her from across the aisle. He did that a lot. She'd catch him stealing looks at her. He smiled, then put his head back, closed his eyes. Mom rested her head on his shoulder. That was it, she decided. Maggie would wait to tell Mom about what had happened at the party until they got home. She could suck it up. She had one more decision to make: when to tell her father about the email she'd received right before they boarded the flight. From the cell phone aggregation service, the company Toby had hooked her up with. She thought she'd thrown away $200, but the report arrived as promised, a one-page map showing blue pins at 2 locations in Tulum. The first was the Moloko bar, where Charlotte, or someone pretending to be Charlotte, had made the call. It verified the caller ID. But more interesting was the second blue dot. It pinged for only one day at an address a few blocks away from the bar. Maybe that was where the caller lived or was staying. If Maggie showed the report to her dad, who at that moment was ordering another beer and beaming, he wouldn't be able to focus on anything else. Whatever fun they were going to squeeze in before going to the Moloko bar would vanish. She was going to tell him, just not right away. Maybe if she waited, the trip would be about them. She looked across the cabin at her father again. Yeah. Who was she kidding?
Chapter 45. Matt Pine. Is he always like this? Matt looked over at his grandfather, who sat catatonic in his old armchair in the nursing home suite. Matt and his aunt were at the small bistro-style dining table. The room was larger than the one his grandfather had occupied when Matt was a boy. And it was cozy, decorated with framed family photos, houseplants, and furniture Matt remembered from his grandfather's house. Whatever you could say about his gruff aunt, she'd taken good care of her dad. He's gotten much worse this year, Cindy said. But when your mom visited, he came alive. She always had that effect on him. Does he know? Cindy shook her head. She didn't say so, but Matt could tell she thought there was no point in telling his grandfather about the tragedy. Matt didn't push it. But didn't his grandfather have a right to know that his daughter was dead? That his son-in-law had perished? That 2 of his grandchildren were gone? There was a tap on the door, and a nurse came into the room. She had a smile on her face, until she noticed Cindy. "I'm sorry, Miss Ford. I didn't know you were still here. I can come back." "Where's Alvita?" Cindy said. "I told Chang that my father didn't need a series of strangers tromping in and out of here. He likes Alvita. I like Alvita." "I'm sorry, Miss Ford. She's off today." Cindy frowned. "I'll come back," the nurse said, retreating as fast as she could out of the room. Matt didn't blame the woman. Cindy turned back to Matt. "I need to talk to you about something." "Sure, what is it?" "It's about the services." Matt had already fielded dozens of texts from Cindy about the funeral, and wondered how there could possibly be more questions, More decisions about the flowers, the photos to display, the program, the obituary, and the other things Matt cared nothing about. He supposed immersing herself in the details was how Cindy was coping with the grief. Noah Braun would like to have the wake at his home, Cindy said. Matt thought about this. Mom's high school boyfriend? The guy from the documentary? Won't it be weird to... Look, it's not ideal. I, frankly, never liked Noah when we were growing up. But he's the governor of the state now. The reason your grandpa has this big room. And I think your parents would want this. Are you sure about that? Because I'm not so sure that we need Noah for Danny's pardon. And there it was. His brother's case had dominated his family in life, so of course it would dominate in death. There was no use fighting about it. Okay. And I know you haven't wanted to talk about it, but we need to take care of your parents' affairs. The house, their credit cards, the will, the life insurance, You're right, I don't want to talk about it, Matt said. It came out more sharply than he'd intended. Reminded him of the outrageous newspaper story from that morning, suggesting he and Danny had killed their family for insurance money. He needed to shake it off. In a softer tone, he said, "After the funeral, I promise." Cindy looked like she was going to protest, but stopped herself. Purposefully changing the subject, she said, "So what did those assholes, the Adlers, want?" She'd asked him the same thing on the car ride over, but he'd shrugged it off. "I guess they're making a sequel," Matt said. Cindy's expression turned to disgust. "I'll never forgive myself for letting them interview me, the way they treated your father. And now they want to put everyone through it all again? It makes me sick." Cindy's eyes were misty. The first sign of emotion, other than irritation or anger, Matt had seen in his aunts since he'd arrived in Adair. He reached across the table and put his hand on hers. Cindy gave a sardonic smile. "We're a pair, aren't we?" Matt didn't know what she meant by that. "All we've got is a guy who doesn't recognize us and another guy in prison for life." There was a dark humor in her voice, masking the pain. "No," Matt said. "We've got each other." It was the right thing to say, the kind thing to say. But the truth was, Matt felt alone, and he wondered if he would always feel this way. Wondered if the loss and pain would always consume him. Wondered if he'd ever recover from the magnitude of it all. Eyeing his frail grandfather staring out at nothing in his beat-up lazy boy, Matt decided that Cindy was right. Grandpa was lucky he'd never know the truth.
Chapter 46. Sarah Keller. Since watching the video at the Adlers' farmhouse, Keller had thought a lot about Charlotte's cousin and the theory that Charlotte was alive. It just didn't ring true. For one, if it wasn't Charlotte who was murdered, who was the young woman with her skull crushed in at the creek? And how did the police and prosecutors screw that up? Charlotte's father might have been abusing her, and she might not be the innocent cheerleader portrayed in A Violent Nature. But that didn't mean she was alive. Even if she was, what would it have to do with the death of the Pines? Still, Keller wasn't drowning in leads. She was playing the waiting game now, waiting for the report on the DNA sample, waiting for the report on the facial wreck of the man and woman in the photo Maggie Pine had sent her brother, waiting on a report from Carlita Escobar. So, Keller decided, she might as well confirm that it was Charlotte buried at that cemetery. Short of digging up the body, Keller thought the best place to test the theory was with those who'd lived the case. Ordinarily, she'd confer with the local prosecutors and detectives, but they'd been under attack since the documentary aired and had circled the wagons. That left Danny's lawyers. Not his hippie lawyer at the trial, whom the documentary painted as borderline incompetent, notwithstanding the fortune the Pine family had paid him. And not the new, white-shoe appellate lawyers the Adlers found too boring to carry the documentary's sequel. Keller wanted to talk to Louise Lester, the passionate attorney who'd taken Danny's case before the cameras were rolling, who by all accounts was a skilled advocate. Keller pulled her rental car into the strip mall in North Omaha. It had a payday loan company, a dollar store, and a nail salon. She scanned the address on her phone to make sure it was the right place. This was it, all right. Then she saw it, at the far end, a plain storefront with a small sign that read, "The Institute for Wrongful Convictions." Keller found Louise Lester at a cluttered desk hemmed in by piles of paperwork. The place had no walls, no separate offices or even cubicles. Just a large room with about 10 workstations, the hum of chatter and clicking keyboards filling the air. It reminded Keller of an old-time press room. These weren't reporters, though. The Institute for Wrongful Convictions was staffed by volunteers, law students, retirees, social justice warriors, which was why Keller had assumed it was open on a Saturday. She felt an electricity in the room. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice," Keller said. She'd been saying that a lot lately. Lester gave her a fleeting smile. She wore no makeup and wore a threadbare suit that was too large for her frame. Keller suspected there was an attractive woman hiding in the boxy attire. Her look screamed, "There are more important things than looking pretty." "Just when you think it couldn't get worse for the Pines," Lester said, her tone melancholy, like the loss wasn't just professional. "Did you know them well?" "Mostly Evan. He was a real advocate for us. A wonderful man." "I saw him in the documentary. He was really passionate." Lester nodded. "Those fucking filmmakers made him seem unbalanced. I would have never participated if I'd known what they'd do to him. They had the nerve to ask me to help with the sequel, and I told them where they could stick their movie." Lester took a cleansing breath, as if she were stopping herself from getting worked up, as if it were something she'd learned to do as a child to temper the fire naturally blazing through her veins. "I'm sorry," she said. "The Adlers just aren't my favorite people. Evan was one of the finest humans you'd ever hope to meet. He didn't deserve what they did to him. And Judy and Ira, they used him in the worst kind of way. They couldn't care less about him or Danny or the thousands of other wrongfully convicted." She waved her arm around the room. "They just wanted the ratings. To hell with the truth. They just wanted to tell a good story." "You think the documentary was just a story?" "Absolutely." "But you represented Danny Pine." "Of course, but not because of the half-assed theories in the documentary. Because his confession was laughably unreliable. I've got 24 other cases that are even worse. But those kids weren't white hometown football stars, the victims not pretty white girls." Lester's eyes flared. They had a vibrant intensity. Keller usually didn't care for true believers. She thought they often suffered from tunnel vision, saw conspiracies that didn't exist. Exhibit A was the Adlers back at the farmhouse. But as she eyed the woman across from her, Keller could only hope her twins would live life with such zeal. Lester continued, "So do I think the unknown partygoer or Bobby Ray Hayes or the boogeyman killed Charlotte? No." "Why do you say that?" "The unknown partygoer is based on the hazy recollection of one kid at the party. He'd been drinking, and he's since had a car accident that left him with a brain injury. So there's no way to test his recollection. Also, someone else would have noticed if some guy in his late 20s was at a high school house party. And eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. You're in the FBI, you know. I know a lot of DNA exonerations involved mistaken eyewitness testimony, Keller said, trying to find common ground. Try 70%. 7 in 10 of people freed by DNA had been convicted based on bad eyewitnesses. Most of the rest were false confessions, Keller said, finishing Lester's sentence and trying to regain control of the conversation. Keller's eyes couldn't help but lock onto the poster behind Lester's desk. It was a disturbing black and white photograph of an African-American boy strapped into the electric chair, his round cheeks streaked with tears as someone tightened the chin strap of the metal helmet that was too large for his head. Under the photo, it read, George Stinney, Jr., executed in 1944 at the age 14 for killing 2 white girls. Exonerated in 2014. Keller ripped her eyes from the image. She needed to focus. So who do you think killed Charlotte? Lester coughed a laugh. I'm not going down that rabbit hole anymore. Trust me, it will consume your life. The case had taken its toll on Lester. Keller remembered a critical scene in the documentary. Lester at the lectern, arguing Danny's case to a panel of appellate judges, her plea both measured and impassioned. Charlotte's head was crushed, like Hayes's known victims, Keller said. Yeah, precisely. But the Smashers' M.O. was reported in Kansas newspapers before Charlotte was murdered, Lester said. And the Kansas police had put out a notice to law enforcement in Nebraska and other neighboring states, hoping that they might identify more victims, which is ultimately how they caught Hayes. The prosecutor in Danny's case should have turned over the notes about the anonymous tip identifying the similarities to Charlotte's murder, but the fact that there was a killer crushing young women's skulls was in the public domain. So why didn't Danny's trial lawyer look into it? Lester shrugged. The guy had never handled a murder case and was in over his head. But the lawyer says he did look into it. Says he got an anonymous tip, too. And that's what the state relied on in our post-conviction fight. I think he was just covering his ass, but the lawyer said he didn't pursue the lead because the forensics didn't match. Hayes sexually assaulted the girls, then killed them by crushing their skulls, probably during the act. But Charlotte wasn't sexually assaulted, and the medical examiner concluded she suffered a separate skull fracture, likely sometime before her head was caved in. Keller felt a combination of sickness and anger in her gut. So, what? You think someone was trying to make it look like Hayes was the killer? That suggested some planning, which was inconsistent with a drunk teenager killing his girlfriend in a rage. Lester said, Hayes confessed to the other murders to get the death penalty off the table, but still denied killing Charlotte. Why bother? What about Detective Sampson? The Adlers say that before he died, he had some explosive information about the blood work. Pfft, how convenient. Even if it's true that he'd go to the Adlers, and I find that questionable, since they basically ruined the man's life, he was hardly credible. If he approached them, it was probably just trying to clear his own name. And before you say it, I've seen the Reddit threads that speculate that he was murdered. Keller wasn't sure whether Lester was a breath of fresh air or whether her years working the case had hardened her, closed her off to any theory that might explain Charlotte's murder. It was for that reason that Keller didn't want to ask the next question. Speaking of conspiracy theories, there is one that is building steam, at least with the Adlers. That Charlotte's alive, Lester said before Keller could get the words out. Lester sighed as if to add, Tell me you're not taking that seriously. Right. Look, I know how it sounds, but I've gotta ask. Lester shook her head. I'd love it if she were alive, but Charlotte's dead. The Adlers don't know this, and it wasn't discussed at the trial, but Charlotte had a distinguishing mark, a tiny tattoo of a heart on her bottom. It was her. Keller exhaled. She knew it was crazy, knew it would end this way, but she was still crestfallen. A piece of advice, Agent Keller, Lester said, her phone buzzing on her desk. Keller nodded. Don't make Charlotte's killer your one-armed man. I've been down that road, and it nearly destroyed me. But what if knowing what really happened to Charlotte is the only way to know what happened to the Pines? Keller asked. Lester put her elbows on the desk, laced her fingers. Then you're fucked, Agent Keller. You're absolutely fucked.
Chapter 47. Evan Pine. Before. Come on, get in on this, Magpie, Evan said. He held the phone in front of him for an airport selfie. Evan didn't know if it was the bright sunshine, the smell of salt in the air, or being on their first family vacation in years, but he felt great, revitalized. Dad, Maggie said, shaking her head. Liv joined in, pressing her face against Evan's. She waved Maggie over. Maggie was turning red. A group of teenage boys was nearby. They weren't watching, but their presence seemed to be enough to mortify his daughter. Tommy said, Can I be in the picture? Evan scooped him up. Of course, but where are your cool shades? Evan had bought them at an airport kiosk. Tommy pulled the plastic sunglasses from his pocket and put them on. We're going to keep it up until you join, Evan said to Maggie. Evan and Liv started doing exaggerated poses, sucking in their cheeks, squinting sexy eyes, making peace signs with their fingers. Fine, Maggie said, marching over. She moved her face into the shot. Take it. Say cheese. Seriously, Dad. Evan and Liv laughed, and he took the shot. Maggie quickly distanced herself from them, but Evan swore he saw the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. Examining the photo, he felt a warmth in his chest, followed by a beat of sadness that the rest of the family, his boys, weren't there. None of that, he told himself. He wanted to keep up the mood, the vibe. He was still buzzed from the warm beer on the plane and the kiss Liv had given him when the kids had dozed off. One that had sent an inferno through him. If she had invited him to the plane's bathroom, he would have risked it and joined the Mile High Club. So no dwelling on Danny or Matt. Or that he had no job. Or that they couldn't afford the trip. Or that he'd come chasing another likely dead-end lead. Stop. Liv looked at the photo. Oh, I'm going to post that one later. She had given up on social media months ago, turned inward, and Evan felt another wave of something that suggested things were different. For Evan, it had come with the handful of pills regurgitated into the sink. What had caused the change in Liv? Evan had another thought. Who fucking cares? He reached for his wife's hand, and she took it quickly, lacing her fingers through his. Are we going to the beach, Daddy? Tommy asked. You bet we are, but we might need to go to the toy store first. Liv gave him a sideways glance, like she was going to say something but stopped herself. Instead, she grabbed his butt. Let's go find the van, sugar daddy. Ew, Maggie made a face, but there was the hint of that smile again. It was 2 hours before the driver announced that they were in Tulum. The van blew past signs for the beach and through the strip of tourist shops on the main road. It cut right onto a side street. The area had a grittier feel, run-down buildings painted in faded primary colors. Palm trees with brown leaves sagging over chain-link fences, a maze of power lines drooping overhead. The consequences of booking at the last minute during the busy season. Liv looked at her husband. He could read her mind. "Don't worry," he said with his eyes. "It will be an adventure." The van took another sharp turn into a small lane carved into a thicket of jungle. At the end of the road was a complex, 6 rental properties, each separated by a tall privacy fence. The van dropped them at the front gate and waited for Evan to punch in the code and get inside before taking off. The sounds of the forest filled the air. Evan entered another code for the front door, and he was pleasantly surprised at the space. It had stone floors and an open floor plan with a modern kitchen overlooking a dining area and living room. Tommy ran down the hall to find his room. When he returned, he fast-walked, twisting around the sofa and the rustic wood table, ultimately landing on one of the stools at the granite kitchen counter. He jumped down from the stool and raced to the sliding doors in the living room. "Where's the beach?" he asked, staring out at the patio. Liv knelt and looked into Tommy's eyes. "We've got something better than a beach." He looked at her, his eyes wide. "We have the jungle." Liv made her hands like a tiger and pawed at Tommy. She glanced up at Evan, offering a smile. Maggie looked around. Evan couldn't quite tell what she was thinking. She peeked out the patio doors. "There are bikes out there. Maybe we can ride into town for dinner." And by nightfall, they were on rickety old bikes, riding down the secluded road into town. Evan's bike had a child seat tethered to the back of it, one of the old models that had likely been recalled in the U.S. years ago. Tommy rode in the lopsided seat, his arms in the air, Liv nervously behind them, calling out for him to hold on to his dad. They found their way to the highway and waited for cars to rip by before they crossed. From there, it was a quick journey on a dirt road that had a wall painted with a mural of a Mayan god. In a restaurant on the Strip, they ate tacos, and Evan and Liv drank too many margaritas. He and Liv laughed, flirted, and couldn't keep their hands off each other. Embarrassed, Maggie pretended not to notice and helped Tommy color the kids' menu, which doubled as a small coloring book. After dinner, they walked through the tourist shops, then made the perilous journey back to the rental property. Maggie insisted on riding the bike with the child seat with her little brother, saying Evan had downed too many cocktails. Evan and Liv rode side by side. Her hair blew in the wind, and she looked lovely in the sundress and sandals Maggie had packed for her. At one point, she challenged Evan to a race, and he pumped his legs with everything he had. The old bike jostled, and Evan had a hard time maintaining control. The front tire skidded on some gravel. Evan careened in slow motion off the asphalt and into the small weed-filled ditch lining the road. Liv threw down her bike and ran to him, concerned, but when she approached, Evan pulled her to the ground, and the two lay in the weeds, laughing hysterically, their daughter looking at them like they'd lost their shit. It was, Evan thought, one of the greatest nights of his life.
Chapter 48. Sarah Keller. Keller sat at the desk in the dreary Adair Motel, her investigation notes and files spread out in front of her. "What's wrong?" her husband said through the speaker on her iPhone. "I'm just so damn frustrated," Keller said. No, fucked was the word Louise Lester had used earlier that day, and Lester fought lost causes for a living. "This is going nowhere, and I'm supposed to give Stan a report in the morning. He's getting a lot of pressure from D.C. "You'll figure it out," Bob said. She wished she could bottle his confidence in her, consume several gallons a week. She'd been gone only 3 days, but she missed his calming presence, missed cuddling the twins, missed sleeping in her own bed. I'm no closer to figuring this out than I was the day I first met Matt Pine. And get this, I just got a call from the lab. My big lead, the blood the filmmaker's investigator found at the scene. It wasn't even blood. They think it was marinara sauce. Bob barked a laugh. Spaghetti sauce? It's not funny. Wait, you're telling me the blood sample wasn't genuine? It was an impasta. Really? Keller grinned in spite of herself. Sorry, Bob said. I'm around 6-year-olds all day. The situation was so ridiculous, you almost had to laugh. She didn't know what she dreaded more, telling Stan, who'd have to report the spaghetti sauce up the chain of command, or telling the Adlers. The sound of Bob crunching on something, probably his favorite Ruffles potato chips, came through the tinny speaker. Okay, so the DNA fizzled out and you've talked to everybody, but don't you always say that people are unreliable anyway? He was right about that. More crunching. So, why don't you be you? Look at the documents, the records. They don't lie. Keller smiled again. You really do listen to me. Did you say something? Bob said. Shut up. She laughed. So, what do you have so far? It was against the rules to talk about an investigation with anyone outside the Bureau. Keller was usually not one to break the rules, but Bob was always her sounding board. The big lug not only calmed her nerves, he was a rare commodity in this world. A good listener. It was why she'd taken to Matt Pine, she thought. He wasn't your average 20-something with delusional confidence, eager to tell you how things were. Like Bob, he listened. Sometimes just saying things out loud, working through her thoughts, helped Keller connect the dots. There's a video the daughter posted, a tip she'd received shortly before they left for Mexico. The timing alone suggests it may be connected. Okay, what's it show? Just a few seconds of teenagers being teenagers. Danny Pine being egged on as he chugged a beer. He's down to an undershirt, surrounded by a bunch of football players. In the last second on the recording, someone's face comes into the frame. The armchair detectives think it's the unknown partygoer. What do you think? I think it could be anyone. There's not enough for facial rec. And I think the video was sent for some other reason. But I've watched it over and over again, and I don't see anything. How'd Maggie Pine get it? I mean, who sent her the video? It was an anonymous tip. Bob blurted a laugh. You're Big Brother. Get on that, G-woman. What's the use of all those NSA toys if you don't get to use them? Trust me, I've been pushing the computer guys to track the sender. It just takes some time. Bob was right, though. The source of the video was important. Whoever sent it did so for a reason. Okay, what else you got? Bob asked. When they were in Mexico, Maggie sent her brother a photo. It was of their father, but I had it enhanced, and Matt noticed something new today. In the background, a woman who tried to set Matt up. No, Bob said. She was in the photo the daughter took before? I know, right? Well, you gotta get on that. I am. I have my contact in Mexico trying to find the woman, but there's something bigger. The photo also has a partial view of a man who seems to fit the description of a guy who tried to mug Matt in New York, shoved him into the street. You're kidding me. The sister took a photo of 2 people, one who tries to set the kid up in Mexico, the other who pushes him into traffic? I mean, right? Keller said. Why, though? What was the point? Bob asked. The phone, Keller said. I think they were trying to get Matt's phone, because Maggie had sent him a photo of them. The rest of the family's phones and computers were wiped clean. So it's, what? A professional? Like a hired killer? Bob was excited. He loved the FBI shows on TV, and for once, Keller's work bore some resemblance. That's what I'm trying to figure out. You love a good paper trail, Bob said. So what records aren't you thinking about? Where haven't you looked? Keller did a mental tally. She had a team going through the Marconi records scooped up in Chicago. She had the computer forensics lab tracking who'd sent the party video to Maggie, the facial analysis unit analyzing the photo Maggie had sent to Matt, and an AV expert enhancing the video and photograph. Airline records, Keller said. I still need to get flight reports. If the guy was in Mexico with the family, then was in New York, I might be able to identify him by cross-checking flights. But without a name, it's a needle in a haystack. Do you know how many people fly to Cancun every day? No. But I also don't know how many bank wire transfers there are every day. I suspect that's way more than flights, yet somehow you catch the bad guys. More with the unbridled confidence in her. And Bob was right. If the man with the cleft lip was in Mexico with the Pines, then flew to New York to go after Matt, then followed Matt back to Tulum, that could narrow the search. Maybe, just maybe, she'd get a hit. Bob exhaled loudly into the phone. What? Maggie Pine. She was 17. She gets admitted to MIT. She gets investigation tips, tracks bad guys to Mexico, gets their photo. She was the shit, you know. I watched the show. Even when she was in middle school, she was unstoppable. It's just a damn shame. I know. That's why she's lucky you're on the case. I'm not so sure about that. No. None of that. You're the shit, too. How else would you have this slice of beef waiting for you at home? I've got to get to bed. I'll call you tomorrow after the funeral, you lunatic. Aight. You got this, Federale. I'm out.
Chapter 49. Matt Pine. Matt drove his grandfather's old station wagon into the Adair Motel parking lot. Tonight, the lot was more crowded than before, jammed with news vans and cars with out-of-state plates. More troops to cover the funeral tomorrow, Matt supposed. He saw Kala standing in front of the door to her room. She wore jeans and a shirt knotted so you could see her midriff, the piercing on her flat tummy. She walked around the long vehicle, eyeing the wood-paneled sides with an amused squint in her eyes. Nice wheels, Kala said, pulling the seatbelt over her shoulder. My grandfather's. I think he's had it since my mom was a kid. How is he? Kala asked. Not great. They say he has moments of lucidity, but I haven't seen any. I'm sorry. Kala put a hand on his shoulder, rubbed it. It's all right. Matt thought back to Cindy's remark. The only family he had left was a brother in prison, a curmudgeon aunt, and a grandfather who didn't recognize him. I'm starving, Kala said. I told you to go to Lincoln with everybody, Matt said. Ganesh and company were getting cabin fever. He'd texted Matt that they needed to go to a real restaurant and a real bar, preferably one without tumbleweeds outside and inbred hicks trying to kill him. It was sweet of Kala to hang back, to make sure Matt wasn't alone. She was from rural Oklahoma, so he supposed she had a higher tolerance for small towns, though even Kala was starting to get that cooped-up look about her. Once you lived in Greenwich Village, it was hard to go back. That was why every New Yorker comes across insufferably superior. Kala said, I needed a break from everyone, and I wanted to see you. You've been gone all day. There aren't many food options this late, Matt said. You'll think of something. Matt drove the clunker out of the lot, not sure where to go. He could head to Lincoln like the rest of them, but it was already late. He was tired, though he wasn't sure why. He'd spent the day watching TV and visiting with his aunt. Kala gazed out the window at nothing. The air was thick. It was already feeling like summer. Anything would be great, she said, still staring outside like she was searching for something on the horizon. Even that crap fast food you and Ganesh like. You're really slumming it, Matt said. When in Rome, Kala replied. It was something she always said, and Matt had picked up the habit of saying or thinking it himself. Funny how you acquire the verbal tics of your friends. We could go to Runza, Matt said. I think it's open late. Go to what? You've never had a Runza? She shook her head. Oh, you don't know what you're missing. Soon Matt was veering onto the interstate, keeping his distance from the semis barreling down every lane. He punched the gas, concerned the old tank wouldn't even hit 50. Kala gripped the plastic handle that hung over the passenger window as the station wagon rattled and finally picked up speed. 10 minutes later, Matt pointed out the window. It's still there. Kala glanced at the glowing green and yellow sign atop a long pole designed to be visible from the interstate. Matt took the exit loop and pulled into the lot. It looks like a McDonald's but green, Kala said. I told you not to get excited. Eat here or get it to go. Kala peered into the restaurant, empty except for a kid in what undoubtedly was a polyester uniform pushing around a mop. Definitely let's get it to go, she said. As Matt pulled up to the drive-through speaker, Kala said, What exactly are they? Matt thought about how to describe them. A runza is like a warm bun filled with beef, onions, and cabbage. It kind of looks like a Hot Pocket. I know it sounds horrible, but it's actually good. A distorted voice came through the speaker. Matt ordered an original runza, fries, and a Coke. Kala leaned over Matt and called out the window, Make that 2 of everything. Back on the road, Kala plucked out one of the fries and bit into it. Is there like a park or somewhere we can eat? Anywhere but the motel. My old school isn't too far away. There used to be outdoor tables. Oh, I get to see the institution that shaped Matthew Pine. I'll spare you the suspense. There was no Dead Poet Society. Kala sipped through her straw, her eyes twinkling. The benches were newer, but in the same place, across from the outdoor basketball court, next to the gym. Kala examined her runza with curiosity, poking at it with a plastic fork. Matt picked his up like a burrito and took a bite. The taste took him back in time. He had no specific memory, just a feeling. Matt scanned the area. The cliché was true that everything looked smaller. The school was a 2-story red brick building. The front was barren, no trees or landscaping. An empty plain of concrete. The dark sky lit up beyond the building, lightning in the distance. So far away, you couldn't hear any thunder. What grade were you in when you left? Kala asked. 9th, Matt said. The school goes from 7th to 12th grade. Not enough kids around here for a separate middle school. So your brother and sister went here with you? Just Danny. Mags was in elementary school when we left. Mom was pregnant with Tommy. Why did you leave town? The documentary made it sound like townsfolk with pitchforks. It wasn't so dramatic. Just a lot of whispers and stares wherever we went. I actually got in a fight right over there about it. He nodded at the basketball court. He hadn't been defending Danny's honor. A kid had said that maybe someone would take Maggie down by the creek. It had scared him, how he'd lost control and wailed on the boy. And if he could lose it like that, he'd realized, so could his older brother. And that was it. We packed up and moved. That was pretty selfless of your parents. I mean, your dad leaving his job, your mom giving up her hometown. Matt had never really thought of it that way, but she was right. He liked that she didn't hesitate to talk about his family. He was learning that it was a topic people were finding uncomfortable. Matt liked talking about them. He didn't want them to vanish as if they'd never existed. Kala picked up the half-eaten runza and put it and her wrappers in the bag. She cleaned up Matt's mess, too. A heavy silence fell between them. At last, Kala said, "Ganesh said that girl at the bar, the one who broke up the fight, that you, met her at 4 a.m? Matt told her about Jessica, how he'd met her at the knoll the night Charlotte was murdered. He almost told her about seeing Danny in his Letterman jacket pushing the wheelbarrow, but tonight wasn't about Danny. She was your first love? I wouldn't go that far. Okay, your first something else? She cocked a brow. Matt rolled his eyes. I was 14. She watched him, waiting for him to tell her more. It was just a kiss. One electrifying kiss. You've got unfinished business with her. Matt shook his head again. I was a kid. Unfinished business, she repeated with a clipped nod. You'd better finish it. Maybe Kala was right, maybe she wasn't. Either way, it would have to wait. Thank you, Matt said. For what? For coming to Nebraska, He paused. For everything. She looked at him for a long time. For a split second, he thought she was going to lean in, give him another kiss he wouldn't forget. Unfinished business, Kala said, emphasizing each word with a poke of her index finger to his chest. She took his hand. Let's get you back. You have a long day tomorrow. It would, undoubtedly, be the longest day of his life. Chapter 50. Evan Pine. Before. They spent their first full day in Tulum at the beach, dozing in rented cabanas, ordering cocktails and virgin daiquiris, and watching Tommy splash in the blue ocean. Sun-drained and tired, they decided to pick up some groceries, eat in for dinner. Evan sat at the kitchen counter, watching his family prepare the meal. Tommy's favorite, spaghetti. Not exactly in line with local cuisine, but it brought Evan back to when they would spend Sunday nights cooking together, telling stories and laughing at the table. Tommy was cutting onions with a butter knife, Liv guiding his hand in between sips of wine. Maggie was in charge of the sauce, and she stirred a big pot with a wooden spoon. No, really, sit down, relax. The women folk have got this, Maggie said to Evan. Evan sipped his beer, taking in the scene. He looked at his son. Tommy's face was tomato red, this after Liv applying sunscreen seemingly every 2 minutes. He was trying to pierce the onion with the dull blade, but it kept rolling off the cutting board. The water's boiling, sweetie, Evan said to Maggie, noticing the pot nearly bubbling over. He jumped off the stool and ran around to the stove to turn down the burner. You been sneaking my beer? He said, noticing that Magpie seemed a little spaced out, lost in thought. Gotta prepare for college, Maggie said. Evan grabbed his heart, feigned a pain in his chest. Don't say that! Not my little girl! He hugged Maggie in an exaggerated embrace that she ordinarily would have fought off, but tonight she just stood, arms at her sides, until he released his hold. With the meal finally ready, the four sat at the dining table, and for the first time Evan could remember in ages, they held hands, bowed heads, and Olivia said grace. Liv's tradition was to give thanks and then say a blessing for each of the children. When she got to Danny, Evan noticed Maggie's eyes fixed on him, as if she were waiting to see his reaction, as if trying to discern whether the only thing on his mind was the case. He gave his best poker face, but his daughter knew him too well. Later, Evan sat at the edge of the bed, contemplating his wife in the faint light seeping in from the ensuite. Liv was naked and had kicked off all the sheets and blankets, out cold from the sun and cocktails and wine at dinner. She was a stunningly beautiful woman. Evan was still buzzed himself and didn't want to leave her, but he needed to get this out of his system. The plan was simple. He'd sneak over to the Moloko bar, where the call had been made, check things out, confirm Charlotte wasn't there, and come home. The rational side of him knew it was crazy, understood that Charlotte was dead. But with Evan, reason often gave way to desperation. He slipped into his shorts and t-shirt from earlier and padded quietly out of the room. The map app on his phone said the bar was about a 10-minute bike ride away. "Where are you going?" Evan felt a thunderbolt rip through him at the voice. Maggie was sitting on the couch in the dark. "Hey, what are you doing up?" "You didn't answer my question." Evan looked at her. "You don't have to answer. I know where. I'm coming." She stood. "No way." Maggie looked at him. "I suppose we could wake up Mom and ask her." Evan narrowed his eyes. Man, he loved this kid. "Seriously, let me come." "It could be dangerous." "Well, then I should definitely wake Mom." Maggie headed toward the master bedroom. "Wait," Evan said. He deliberated for a moment, but once his daughter grabbed onto something, she didn't let go. He knew where she'd acquired that trait. "You'll wait outside." Maggie nodded. "And if I say you go home, you listen." She nodded again. "And I got it, Dad. It's only 11:30. Trust me, the place is going to be packed. It's Tulum, not Naperville." Evan let out an exasperated sigh. "I mean it. If I say you need to leave, then—" Maggie smiled, already tying the laces on her sneakers. They rode the bikes along the dark road, Evan wondering if this was a mistake. Maggie was in front of him, her hair in a thick braid swaying back and forth like the pendulum of a grandfather clock. For some reason, he thought of the out-of-place clock in Dr. Silverstein's office. He saw lights up ahead. When they reached the intersection, Maggie waited for Evan, eyeing the map on her phone. "Not too much farther," she said. "The place is just off the main drag." They continued on the dark asphalt, music floating in the wind now. The lights in the distance brighter. Maggie led the charge as they pedaled around clusters of pedestrians and to the Moloko bar, which was just around the bend from an outdoor cantina. Even this late, the area was bustling. Maggie stopped across the street from Moloko. She looked conflicted, like she wanted to say something. "Everything okay?" Evan asked. "Just be careful, all right?" Evan smiled, got off the bike, and crossed the street. The doorman looked at him wearily, as if Evan was the sad old guy at the club, but he waved Evan through. Inside was what he'd expected. Large crowd, pulsing dance music, the smell of perfume and sweat. He scanned the faces, looking for... It was at times like this, unexpected, unusual, that he had moments of clarity. Charlotte wasn't here. He was chasing a ghost, wasting his final days before Magpie went to college, squandering his life with Liv and Tommy, ruining his relationship with Matt. He needed to let this go. But he was here. Might as well. He navigated through the crowd and made it to the bartender. The barman had tattoo sleeves and a hipster beard. He wasn't Mexican, but it wasn't clear he was American either. The music was loud. The guy shouted over the noise. "What can I get you, mate?" He had an Australian accent. Evan laid a 500 peso bill on the bar, if only because that was what they did in the movies and TV when they were trying to get information. He held out his phone, displaying a photo of Charlotte. "I'm trying to find my daughter," he lied. He assumed the bartender might be more sympathetic to a father than if he thought Evan was a cop or a private investigator or a creepy old guy looking for a young woman. Evan waited for him to say he'd never seen her before, that he was sorry he couldn't help. The bartender smoothed a hand over his beard, then closed his fist around the money. "Yeah, I've seen her."
Chapter 51. Sarah Keller. Keller awoke to the buzz of her phone. She was disoriented for a moment, trying to comprehend why her nightstand was different, the window of her bedroom not where it should be. Then she remembered. Nebraska. The motel. The old alarm clock said it was only 11:40 p.m., but she'd been in a deep sleep. She was going to ignore the call, but it might be Bob, an emergency with the twins. The number was from Mexico. Keller sat up, switched on the lamp, swiped the device. "It's Carlita Escobar?" Keller's thoughts were still fuzzy, and she blanked for a second, but then the fog lifted. Of course, the consular officer, Carlita, no relation, Escobar. "Hi, yes, thanks for getting back to me." "I'm sorry. Did I wake you?" "You said to call when I got news. No matter the time. I can call back tomorrow." "No, please. I've identified the girl." "Hank?" Keller asked. "Her real name is Joanna Grace. She went by Joey. It turns out she is from Oklahoma, but she's no hairdresser." Keller felt a rush of adrenaline. The fake persona confirmed that her meeting with Matt was no accident, that she'd lured him off with her, likely to deliver him to someone, until she apparently had a change of heart. "She's a party girl," Escobar continued. "Works for a company out of New York." "You mean a prostitute?" Keller was on her feet now, pacing. "Not quite. I checked into it, and her employer is basically like a leasing company. But instead of renting products, it's pretty girls. Nightclubs and resorts pay to have American girls hang out at their establishments. It's like a temp service." "That's an actual thing. Go figure." "In my day, the clubs had ladies' night. But I guess that's not enough anymore," Escobar said. "I suspect some of the girls make money on the side doing more than looking pretty. But it's otherwise a legitimate business." "Did you speak with her?" There was a long beat of silence. "No. The reason we identified her so quickly was that some of the other girls in her troupe, they're all working out of a club called Moloko. They reported her missing." Keller felt her stomach drop. She stopped pacing, opened the curtains, and looked outside for no reason. Several news satellite trucks were parked in the lot. "Let me guess. No one has seen her since the night with Matt Pine." "That's right." "I suppose she could have taken off. Matt said she got cold feet, so maybe she's hiding from whoever she was working with." She and the other girls stayed in rooms above the club. We searched her bunk and locker. She left her passport, and the rental car, she shared it with 2 other girls, was found abandoned in Chan Chimoyel, about 15 minutes from Tulum. Escobar paused. I'm sorry. Keller let out a breath. What else do we know about her? Any priors? Known associates? She had a prior for cocaine possession in Oklahoma, but that's it. Nothing that identifies the man with her in the photo. She's had a tough run, Ms. Grace. Her father died in the Oklahoma City bombing when she was young. She spent her teenage years in foster care, then worked at a gentleman's club, which is where she probably got hooked up with the party girl company. Nothing on the man with the cleft lip scar. Keller's blood pressure was rising, her jaw clenched. She shut the curtains and sat on the bed. She needed to calm down, think clearly. He's a ghost. It does look like he rented the place at the address you sent me. The address tenacious Maggie Pine had found through a cell phone aggregation service. Keller had a random thought. Maybe Maggie would have become an FBI agent. Escobar continued. He gave the last name Smith, paid in cash. The owner never dealt with him in person. He sent the money by messenger, but the neighbors saw him a few times. And the rental property, it was scrubbed down with bleach. I don't think it has ever been so clean. Cleaning crews usually aren't that detailed. I can send a team, and I don't think you're hearing me. The place was clean, and not by any maid service. More like a forensics expert. A professional, Keller said. It was consistent with the staged crime scene, the wiped phones. Escobar said, Makes sense. CCTV cameras in the area? Keller knew the answer, but had to ask. I'm sorry, but this isn't Manhattan, Agent Keller. Is there anything at all that will help us ID the guy? Keller knew the answer to this as well. Escobar paused, then said, I feel like Gutierrez knows something. It's a pretty corrupt force. The cop who gave us trouble releasing the bodies? The one who threatened Matt Pine? See. Did you talk to him? I tried, but he refuses to speak with me. Keller worked through this. She couldn't force a foreign municipal police officer to cooperate with them, and Carlita Escobar was the person the State Department said had the best chance of dealing with the Tulum force. Now even she was getting stonewalled. I'm open to ideas, Keller said. After another long silence, Escobar said, There may be a way to get Gutierrez to tell us what he knows. Keller wasn't sure what she meant by that. The way Escobar said it made Keller wary. What do you mean? He won't answer my questions. He knows I'm constrained by American interview techniques. Keller tried to digest where Escobar was going with this, and didn't like it. But I'm family friends with a state senator. He holds sway with the Mexican federal police. And I'm sure he could get them to question Gutierrez. Keller was starting to wonder whether, despite her protests to the contrary, Escobar was in fact related to Pablo. She imagined the local cop in a basement that had a drain in the middle of the floor. Escobar said, Of course, I would never ask them to do that. But if the senator knew Gutierrez was making the U.S. State Department unhappy, he might take the matter into his own hands. Keller wanted the man with the cleft lip. He was now linked to the disappearance of Joey Grace and death of the Pines. But she wouldn't break the law. Let's call that Plan B, Keller said. Of course, I wasn't suggesting. Did you find anything else? Keller said, sparing Escobar the false denial. One more thing, Escobar said. The bartender where the girl worked. He said he'd seen her with a man who fits the description. Just one time. But he remembered because Joey Grace made the bartender an unusual offer. Keller felt a flutter of excitement again. What was it? She paid the bartender 4,000 pesos to call a cell phone number if anyone came to the bar looking for an American girl. Did he ever make that call? See, he said a man, an American, showed up at the bar one night looking for a girl. Evan Pine, Keller said. See, I showed the bartender a photo, and he confirmed. Keller played this out in her mind. The man with the cleft lip scar hired a local party girl to pose in a video as Charlotte to make a deepfake and lure Evan Pine to Tulum, perhaps making it easy for Evan to trace her to the particular club. Then he paid the bartender there to call him when Evan arrived and started asking questions. This had to be a professional. Thank you for all your hard work on this, Keller said. My pleasure. Then, in a matter-of-fact tone that sent a chill down Keller's back, Escobar said, I'll contact you when we find the girl's body. Chapter 52. Maggie Pine. Before. Maggie and her father walked side by side along the dirt pathway at the Mayan ruins in Tulum, the afternoon sun beating down on them. Mom was chasing after Tommy, who'd run ahead. The ruins were somewhat disappointing, Maggie thought. Too many tourists. Not so many ruins. There was even a Starbucks, for goodness sake. It reminded Maggie of an ancient college campus made of crumbling stone. The centerpiece was a tall temple facing an open field, with smaller buildings at the perimeter. The area wasn't in a jungle, like in the old Indiana Jones movies Matt used to watch over and over, but atop a cliff overlooking the ocean. Dad, you know this isn't right. It's all too perfect. The caller ID leads us right there. The bartender at Moloko just happens to know Charlotte out of all the customers they get every night? Wants you back there tonight at midnight by yourself? Her dad put up his hands as if to quiet her down. He looked out at Mom and Tommy again. We'll talk about this later. Maggie frowned. They hadn't had a chance to talk since last night, and she didn't like keeping this from Mom. She looked at her father and had the sinking feeling that nothing she could say would stop him. The never-ending loop of her life. Evan Pine, fixating on a clue, running it into the ground, getting discouraged, swearing he was done with it all, then identifying a new clue and repeating the cycle. A drug addict in search of a fix. Now he was going to screw up this trip, put himself in danger, walking into a trap. Was it a trap? Or a prank? Someone trying to shake him down? She didn't know, but she did know something was off, and that they'd been lured to the Moloko bar. It's a scam, Maggie said. I know. This surprised Maggie. Her father wasn't one to give up so easily, but something was different today. So, you're not going back tonight? I haven't decided. It could be dangerous, Dad. He didn't respond, just waved to her mom, who was looking hot and exasperated as she wrangled Tommy back toward them. Maggie decided she couldn't keep it from him anymore. She hoped it wasn't a mistake. But telling him about the cell phone report, the address where the phone that called him pinged, was the only way to get him to stay away from the bar. I have something I need to tell you. A new lead. But only if you promise not to go to Moloko tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. I uncovered something. It could answer who's behind this, who really called you. Her father looked at her intently, in that way he would. "What is it?" he said. "And why didn't you tell me before? I need a promise." "Okay, I promise." "I'm serious," Maggie said. "I know. So serious," her dad said playfully. Her mom and Tommy appeared. Mom gave them a skeptical look. "What are you two up to?" "Maggie's decided to take a gap year. Or 2. Live with us until she's 30, her dad said. "That would be totally fine with me." Liv gave her a side hug. They were so embarrassing. "Actually," Maggie said, "Dad said he was taking me out to dinner tonight. Just me." "He is he? What are you two plotting?" Tommy interrupted them. "What's a human sacrifice?" He pronounced it sacrifice. "Where'd you hear that, sweetie?" Mom said. "Those people over there were saying that's where they would make human sacrifices." He pointed to a stone platform in the center of the ruins. Her parents looked at each other. Dad said, "You want to take this one?" "All yours, handsome," Mom said. "That's what happens when you ditch me for dinner." Chapter 53. Maggie and her father had a quick dinner at a place called Burrito Amor, then turned to the plan. They didn't have all night to wait for someone to come out of the house identified in the cell phone report, so they'd have to be more proactive. Maggie wrote a simple note. "We know you made the video, pretending to be Charlotte, and we've called the police." It took some doing, but she convinced her dad to give it a try. He'd be crazy to go to the bar tonight. That was where they wanted him. They needed to be the hunter, not the hunted. Maggie felt so cool right now. They rode the bikes to the small, run-down house in the twilight. Maggie waited at the corner under the cover of a stand of shrubs. She watched her father ride his bike to the broken sidewalk in front of the house. He looked around to see if anyone was watching, then pedaled to the front door. The place was a one-story ramshackle structure with bars protecting the windows. She'd Googled the address, and it popped up as a vacation rental property. So, with luck, the owner of the phone that pinged at the location was still there. Otherwise, the new tenant would likely be freaked out by the note. Her dad's back was to her, but when he turned around, she saw that he'd taped the note to the front door. He positioned the bike away from the house, gave a hard knock, then rode for his life. Maggie's heart pounded as she watched him race away, praying he'd make it without being spotted. With only seconds to spare, he disappeared around the corner as the door opened a crack. The silhouette of a man emerged in the doorway, and he removed the note. It felt like an eternity, the man standing there, a dark mass. Maggie's father had circled around and was next to her now. "He's reading it," Maggie whispered. The man's movements became quick, jerky. His head snapped back and forth, looking for whoever had left the note. Then he turned and went back inside, slamming the door behind him. Maggie and her father looked at each other. Her dad was perspiring, out of breath. "Now what?" he said. Maggie honestly hadn't thought that far ahead. She didn't need to decide, because the door to the house flung open. The man was wearing a ball cap and sunglasses. He walked head down. His gait suggested he was agitated. He said something into his cell phone. They followed him to the main drag. It was easy to keep a safe distance. He was tall and skinny, and his hat drifted above the crowd on the main road. Sure enough, he went to the Moloko bar, which looked different in the daylight. The place apparently didn't open until the evening. He waited out front, as if he were expecting someone. Out came a woman, pretty. She wore shorts and a bikini top. The man said something to her. She shook her head repeatedly. "Let's get a picture," Maggie said. She held up the camera. It was too far away to get a clear shot, even if she zoomed. "We need to get closer." She got off the bike. "No," her father said. "Come with me. Keep your back turned. They'll think we're tourists." Her dad didn't have a chance to object. Maggie pushed his bicycle's handlebars, wheeling him backwards so she could get the picture. She pretended to take a photo of her dad. His face was in the frame, but Maggie was really trying to get a clear shot of the couple. They were in the shadows, the neon from the sign casting a glow over the woman. Just as Maggie was taking the shot, the man covered his face with his hand. The woman seemed to fix her eyes on Maggie. "We need to go," Maggie said. She turned, climbed on the bike, and started to ride away, her father right behind her. She didn't look back.
Chapter 54. Matt Pine. 4 coffins were stationed at the far end of the church, but it was the 4th one, the tiny wooden box, that caused each and every mourner to gasp as they entered First Presbyterian Church. The stained glass, the same windows Matt used to stare at, bored out of his mind on the Sundays of his youth, dulled the light, fitting the gloomy occasion. The place was packed, though Matt didn't recognize many of the bereaved. Several had the grooming of television news reporters, hair helmeted with too much hairspray, faces too tan for the spring. His aunt said they were going to keep out the media and gawkers and grief junkies, but there was only so much they could do. Despite the Pines' persona non grata status, several townspeople filled the pews. As Matt paced the long aisle, he could feel the eyes on him, hear the murmurs as he walked toward the 4 caskets. He just looked ahead, feeling distant, vaguely out of body. When he reached the front, Aunt Cindy patted the open space on the pew. Next to her was his grandfather, with a faraway expression. His Jamaican nurse, looking more grief-stricken than Charlie. Next to Grandpa was the governor, Mom's old friend. With the prison refusing to allow Danny to attend the ceremony, that was it, the Pine contingent. After lowering himself to the pew, Matt felt hands on his shoulders. He turned, and it was Kala. Next to her, the rest of the misfit toys. All were dressed conservatively, something he'd never seen before in all their time together. Even Ganesh was in a suit, an expensive one by the looks of it, the contrast with his unruly hair and unshaven face giving him the look of a tech mogul. Curtis's head was bowed in prayer. Wu Jin looked like a giant next to Sophia, whose makeup was already streaked down her face. Matt gave them a nod and turned back. He stared at the caskets again. They were simple, understated. Despite her beauty, Matt's mother had hated Flash. When his aunt had emailed him the catalog of coffins, it had taken Matt only a moment to choose. The old minister, the same one from all those years ago, approached the front of the church and waited for the crowd to settle. Then, in a weak voice that again brought Matt back to when he was a boy, the minister began his remarks. Something else hadn't changed. Matt was able to tune out the guy instantly. Instead, he focused on the caskets. He swallowed at the smallest box. Matt said goodbye in his head. "Tommy, I'm sorry the world won't get more of you. You were loving, hilarious, and you came when we needed you most." Tears rolled down his cheeks. "Goodbye, little man." His eyes slid to the next box. Maggie. Matt released a sob. "You were the heart of this family. The glue. and there won't be a day that goes by where I won't miss you. The world is a worse place without you. Even when I was away at school, you were with me. My conscience, my better angel, my proof in the fundamental goodness of people. Goodbye, Mags. He had a fist lodged in his throat now. There was movement in the church, and he saw a figure take the microphone. The governor. Matt eyed his mother's casket, then his father's. He wanted to say goodbye before the politician started blathering on. The rituals, the remarks didn't mean anything to him. He didn't need the show. Before he said his goodbyes, a siren wailed outside. The sound intensified, and the church filled with a low rumble of voices. Matt turned and looked at his friends. Ganesh was making a what-the-fuck expression at the others. They all looked dumbfounded at the noise, except Kala, who was from Oklahoma. Matt heard her whisper, "Tornado warning." "All right, folks, I hate to do this," the governor was saying into the microphone. Next to him, the minister was giving him instructions. "We need everyone to get down to the basement." The din of the crowd grew louder. "We've all been through this a million times, and it's probably nothing, but better safe than sorry. So let's stay calm and make our way to the stairs." Quickly, mourners moved one pew at a time and marched up the aisle. The minister was at the top now, directing traffic. Matt caught Ganesh's eye. His friend gave him a sly smile and winked at him. It was an odd gesture, but somehow perfect. It was an orderly exit. Aunt Cindy tried to usher Matt along with her, but he held back, said he wanted to make sure his friends got squared away. In truth, he wanted a moment alone to finish his goodbyes. Matt wasn't scared of the tornado. In his 14 years in Adair, there had been countless warnings, a twister or two touching down in cornfields, but he'd never even seen a funnel cloud. His aunt reluctantly agreed, mostly because she needed to tend to Matt's grandpa, who was riled up by the commotion. With the church cleared out, Matt stood alone with the caskets. The wind was whistling outside, and there was a crack of lightning. He touched a hand to his mother's coffin, then his father's. There were no words, he decided. Matt turned, and instead of heading to the basement, he loosened his tie and walked out into the storm.
Chapter 55. Sarah Keller. Keller looked at herself in the motel room mirror. She wore her usual navy pantsuit and white blouse. It wasn't perfect funeral attire, but it would have to do. She considered skipping the ceremony, wondered about the optics, an FBI agent at the church, but she decided to risk it. Though she'd never met them, she felt like she knew the Pines. She'd been through their belongings, studied their internet searches, talked with their friends, spent time with their surviving son. Surviving sons. Plural, she reminded herself. She wanted to pay her respects. Her cell phone rang. She was already running behind and was going to ignore it. She wanted to slip into the church with the flock, rather than rush in late with a spotlight on her, but the call was from Fishkill Correctional. "Agent Keller," she answered. "Hi, this is Marge Boyle at Fishkill returning your call." The prison liaison sounded bored, lethargic. "Thanks for getting back to me. I'm just closing my file, crossing my T's and dotting my I's, and I wondered if you could send me the visitor log for Daniel Pine for the last 6 months." There had been leaks about the investigation coming from different fronts, and Keller wanted the liaison to think the request was routine. "No problem. We keep electronic copies. If you give me a second, I can email the log to you right now. I have it somewhere, I'm sure, but can you give me your email address?" Keller did, and waited, gathering her keys and handbag so she could race out the door to make the funeral. She heard keyboard clicking as the liaison worked, excruciatingly slow. The woman was on prison time. I'm actually running late to the funeral, so I need to... It's really terrible about Dan, the liaison said, not taking the hint. Yes, it's disappointing the warden wouldn't let him attend the funeral, but I understand it's a drain on resources, and... Wait, the liaison said. You don't know? No one notified you? Notified me of what? Keller said, not raising the obvious question of who the hell would notify her of something other than the liaison she was on the line with. Oh, sweet Jesus, the woman paused. Dan Pine was attacked yesterday. They're not sure he's gonna make it. It was another half hour before Keller arrived at the church. She'd been delayed because she needed to tell Stan the news about Danny Pine before the media picked up the story. The church was not picturesque. No old-time steeple with pristine grounds. Just a modern-looking structure that could have passed for a bank, were it not for the stained glass windows and sign out front. Lining the road were satellite trucks and makeshift tents made of tarps to protect equipment from the imminent rain. Reporters milled around, holding paper cups of coffee and primping in hand mirrors, waiting for the ceremony to end. Keller pulled in next to several other vehicles parked illegally in the grass at the far end of the overflowing lot. She walked quickly, and the reporters paid her no mind. The air was strangely still, the sky an unusual shade of green. She felt an electric current in the atmosphere. Inside, the front entryway of the church was quiet. She could hear voices coming from behind the two large doors that led into the nave of the church. She debated waiting it out, not wanting to interrupt the ceremony. But a man in a dark suit came out of one of the doors and headed toward a sign for the men's restroom. Reaching to catch the door before it closed, Keller was startled by a piercing sound, a wailing siren, coming from outside. What the hell? Keller realized that it was a tornado siren. The Pine family just couldn't catch a break. The doors opened, and mourners started filing out. They headed to a stairwell near the restrooms. Keller found herself in the queue, pushed quietly along to the basement stairs. The old man in front of her grumbled as he made his way down one painful step after the other. "Overreacting as always," the old man said. "It'll be gone by the time we get down there." Keller imagined that this was how it was everywhere. If you lived in Manhattan, you were immune to terror warnings. If you lived in San Francisco, you didn't get jarred when the ground shook. If you lived in Florida, you took hurricane watches in stride. And if you lived here, you calmly shuffled to lower ground when funnels threatened to fall from the sky and destroy everything in their path. She must have looked rattled, or maybe it was plain she was an out-of-towner, because once they reached the church's basement, an elderly woman put a hand on Keller's arm. "Don't worry, dear. We get these all the time." After a few minutes, mourners filled the entire basement. Keller stood near a bulletin board pinned with announcements, community bake sales, an AA meeting schedule, a poster for the Cub Scouts, and tried not to knock over the folded metal chairs leaning against the wall. Looking for Matt, she scanned the crowd. In the far corner, a small group huddled around Matt's aunt. A black woman stood next to Cindy, and Keller could make out someone's head, the grandfather probably, who was sitting down. She didn't see Matt. In the other corner, she spotted a group of college-aged kids, an interesting ensemble. A drop-dead gorgeous blonde, a mischievous-looking Indian kid, a Korean guy who was so tall that he had to crouch to avoid his head hitting the ceiling, a black kid with kind eyes, and a tiny woman with mascara that had run down her face. Matt's friends from NYU, she assumed. Matt wasn't with them either. She needed to talk to him. It was the absolute worst time to tell him about his brother. But she didn't want him learning about the attack from the feed on his phone. She was becoming an expert at delivering bad news to Matt Pine. She looked over to another small crowd. The governor was standing in the center, holding court. The only surprise was that there was no camera on him, no footage for the sequel to A Violent Nature, though Keller imagined the aunt had banned the Adlers from the ceremony. The minister was making his way through the mourners to speak to the governor. "All right, folks," the governor said in a loud voice, slicing through the noise. The minister was standing next to him. "The warning has been lifted. If I can ask everyone to head back upstairs," he directed an arm to the stairwell. "Single file, please." The crowd parted to let Matt's grandfather and aunt head up first. Led by a caregiver, the grandfather looked disoriented, confused. Keller watched everyone else go as she looked for Matt, hoping she could pull him aside. No, she decided. She'd ask him to meet her after the services. Wait until then to tell him about his brother. She checked her phone to see if Danny's attack had made the news. Nothing yet. 2 emails, back to back, grabbed Keller's attention. First, the liaison had sent the prison visitor log for Danny Pine. She could review that later. Second, the computer team had found who had sent the video of the party to the Free Danny Pine site. A local Adair woman, whose name Keller didn't recognize. Keller glanced toward the stairwell. The line up the stairs had stalled. Killing time, she dispatched a text to the field office to get background on the woman who'd sent the anonymous tip. Next, she clicked on Danny's visitor log. It was not extensive. Visits from his parents, lawyers. But one name jumped out at her. Neil Flanagan. The name was so familiar, but Keller couldn't place it. Where had she heard it? She decided to use every cunning FBI agent's secret crime-fighting tool, and typed the name into Google. Newspaper stories lit up her phone. Flanagan was embroiled in the former governor's sex scandal, a fixer who'd arranged parties for the governor and his wealthy benefactors. Underage girls. Drugs. A grand jury had indicted Flanagan, and everyone expected him to turn on the former governor and others in his circle. Why would this creep visit Danny Pine? Just 2 weeks before his parents were killed by a professional. She thought of her meeting with the filmmakers. They said Charlotte had a secret life. Older men. Several of the newspapers quoted the lead prosecutor, an AUSA, out of the Lincoln U.S. Attorney's Office. Keller tapped out an email to Stan. She needed to talk to Flanagan pronto.
Chapter 56. Matt Pine. Matt walked along the road, the sky dark and green, a single raindrop splashing his face, the preamble of more to come. The sirens had stopped at least, no funnel clouds forming, so the only thing Matt risked now was getting drenched. He should return to the church. He didn't want to look back and regret skipping the ceremony. But would he, really? He sauntered along with no destination. Papillon Road was a slice of asphalt that led to nowhere. He'd cut across the church's playground for the Sunday school kids and through a side fence that bordered the grounds to avoid the reporters camped out front. The shoulder was rocky. It reminded him of his death march in Tulum. Was that really only 3 days ago? Was that possible? His feet hurt in the tight dress shoes. He owned only one suit and one pair of nice shoes. Before leaving New York, Ganesh had plodded over to Matt's dorm and packed them for the funeral. It was a thoughtful gesture, and Matt would never take his friends for granted again. He'd taken too much for granted in his life, so no more. From behind him, a car tapped 2 fast beeps of the horn. Matt turned and looked at the vehicle, which was trailing him. The windshield was speckled with rain, and he couldn't see who was driving. He was in no mood to talk to a reporter. The vehicle crawled up beside him, the window humming down. You know there's a tornado warning, right? Jessica Wheeler looked at him from inside the car, a tiny smile on her lips. She was dressed in black, her hair pulled up, a strand of pearls around her neck. She must have seen Matt slip out of the church and followed after him. Where are you headed? Nowhere. You and me both, she said. The car kept the slow pace of his walk. Matt stopped and the car came to a halt as well. He looked inside. Jessica pointed her chin at the passenger seat. Matt really wanted to be alone. At least he thought he did. Jessica just sat quietly, waiting for him to decide. His feet did hurt, he supposed. He climbed inside and was met with the smell of Jessica's perfume, a pleasing, spicy fragrance. She shoved the stick shift into gear, and they drove. The rain was still coming down in tiny drops, not yet a downpour. The windshield wipers wisped back and forth, an arc of brown from dirt and drizzle. Want to talk about it? Jessica finally asked. Not particularly. Okay. Want a drink about it? That sounds more enticing. She nodded, looked in her rearview mirror, then made a sharp U-turn right in the middle of the road. It wasn't long before Jessica was unlocking the front door to pipe layers. The place didn't open for a few hours, and it was dark, quiet. Jessica slapped on the lights, threw her keys on the bar, and went to the jukebox. Matt took a seat on one of the stools and watched her in the reflection of the mirror behind the bar. With her conservative black dress, she looked out of place bent over, peering into the jukebox. Music filled the room. Jessica walked over and ducked behind the bar. Bon Jovi? Matt said. Jessica stood in front of Matt now. My uncle hand-picked the jukebox selection 30 years ago, and I haven't had the heart to change it. And who doesn't love some John Bon Jovi? She gestured to the liquor bottles lining the wall. What'll you have? A beer would be great. Ah, come on, she said, disappointed in him. Wait, I know. She pulled out a glass, plopped an oversized single ice cube into it, and started mixing some concoction. She slid the glass to him. He held the drink at eye level, the clear cube bathed in brown liquid with a citrus rind. What is it? An old-fashioned? He raised an eyebrow. Is this just some Don Draper fantasy of yours, or— Shut up! Try it! He took a sip. It was actually quite good. Smoky, with a hint of sweet. I didn't peg myself as an old-fashioned guy, but it's good. She nodded, then poured herself a beer, smiling as she did so, silently acknowledging that she'd just given him shit for wanting something as pedestrian as a beer. She took a sip, foam covering her top lip. They didn't speak for some time. He'd finish a drink, she'd make him another. She'd finish hers and pour another, as if it were a competition. It wasn't long until both were feeling the booze. Matt's phone shivered repeatedly in his pocket, but he never checked it. The funeral was nice, Jessica said. You mean until the blaring sirens and the surviving son took off? She made a face. Your grandpa looked well. I haven't seen him around town in forever. Matt held the old-fashioned in his hand, contemplating it. You don't know how much I appreciate this, but really, there's no need for small talk. He drained his glass. No, she said. All right. She leaned over the bar, grabbed Matt by the lapels of his suit, and pulled him into a kiss. He wasn't expecting it, which gave the adrenaline slamming through him even more of a kick. Not moving her mouth from his, Jessica scaled the bar, knocking over glasses and bar tools until she was on the other side. When she finally pulled away, both were breathing heavily, Jessica's hair falling from the pins that held it in place. There's a room upstairs, she said. He nodded, following her to a door in the back. She fumbled for her keys, kissing him again as she unlocked the door to a narrow stairwell. She took his hand. His head was swimming. From the booze, from the hunger for her, from the surrealness of the day. Jessica walked unsteadily up the stairs. Matt started to have second thoughts. He beat them back, but they kept leaping into his head. He'd thought of this girl for 7 years, and was this how he wanted it to go? Sloppy, in a room above a bar, on the day of his family's funeral, no less? But he did want her, and he needed something to make him feel good right now. Finish the unfinished business, as Kala had said. But the thought of Kala only intensified his feeling that this was a mistake. At the top of the stairs was a small room with a twin bed, a nightstand, and a television. Jessica tugged off Matt's suit jacket, pulled the loosened tie over his head, and unbuttoned his shirt, then his pants. Then she stopped and said, "Wait here, I'll be right back." She skipped to the bathroom connected to the room. Matt sat on the bed, battling with himself. His phone started buzzing again. His aunt looking for him, probably. His friends. He pulled it from his pocket to put it on silent mode. A text on the home screen caught his eye. The display showed only a few words of the text, but one of them was urgent. He shouldn't check. Don't check. But his thumb didn't oblige, and up popped the full text message from Agent Keller. Urgent, please call me. Simple and to the point, like Keller. She wasn't the kind of person to throw around the word urgent. He clicked on her number. Right as Keller picked up, Jessica came out of the restroom wearing nothing but the string of pearls. Staring at her milky white skin, he was speechless for a moment. She looked stunning. He was about to hang up when Keller's voice said, "Matt, thanks for getting back to me. I've got some terrible news." She waited a moment, then said, "It's about your brother."